I'm going to suggest, Andrew Coyne, that this book of yours, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, is not going to win you many friends with current parliamentarians. You make disparaging remarks about MPs, you call them nobodies. You talk about cabinet ministers not having any real power. And you also talk about the Senate. You describe the Senate as, quote, the appendix of Confederation, a largely inert organ of uncertain purpose. Why do you think the Senate is really actually poses a danger to the democracy?
Look, it's not because there aren't some good people in the Senate. There's also been a lot of bad people in the Senate over the years because they could be of any character or whatever. And as long as the prime minister saw fit to appoint them, in they went. Again, appointed upper houses are extremely rare, needless to say. One of the few that comes to mind would be the British House of Lords. If you go back to 1958, the percentage of appointments to the House of Lords that came from the party of the prime minister that appointed them, I think was something like a little over half. In Canada, it's 99% or 98%. As usual, we've taken everything to this extreme where the Senate is just this hysterically patronage appointed house, and where oftentimes people had no qualifications, whatever. The idea was supposed to be that was going to keep the Senate in line. Well, right from the get-go, it didn't really quite work out that way. Senate, for the first decades of Confederation, quite regularly voted down government legislation, and particularly after there'd been a change of government when there was an overhang of senators from the previous party. They had no compunction at all. It settled down in the mid-20th century, and they fell into this kind of somnolence where they really weren't really doing much of anything, which is hardly a great situation either, but I would argue preferable. But they've been starting to feel their oats in recent decades. And they've been asserting themselves more and more, and in ways that I think, frankly, are just fundamentally anti-democratic. You cannot have a body of unelected senators overruling the people's elected representatives.
But Andrew Coyne, maybe you're not appreciating the role that they're supposed to play. Senators. The Senate is supposed to be the chamber of sober second thought. It's supposed to protect the interests of smaller provinces. It's supposed to protect the interests of minorities. Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America talks about the danger of the tyranny of the majority. The Senate is supposed to play the role of protecting, marginalized communities that might be abused by the majority.
Well, in my view, that's the role of the Charter of Rights and the Constitution and the courts, and which is a very different kettle of fish. And again, the Fathers' Confederation saw a very limited role for the Senate. I would argue there should be almost no role for an unelected body, at least as it regards overturning legislation passed by the House of Commons. Either we believe in democracy or we don't. By what theory of democracy can a bunch of partisan appointments assume the power that's like 53 senators should have the same power as the MPs elected by tens of millions of Canadians? That makes no sense whatsoever.
But the idea is that these folks are supposed to have some kind of moral suasion because they are esteemed people. They've done things in their lives. They're supposed to be above the fray somehow and trying to protect the commons. Like they're trying to protect the institutions of the society. So they have the best interests of the society at heart. And so they're not expected to exercise these powers all the time. They're supposed to use their discretion. And when those minorities need to be protected, that's when the senators are supposed to intervene.
That's not what they've actually done. That's not been the role the senators played. It's either been a rubber stamp for the government if it agreed with the government of the day, or it was a partisan body for making mischief with the government. It's not ever really played that role of representing the less populous regions, for example, which is one of the reasons why the provinces have become so obstreperous over there, provincial governments, because there hasn't been this effective body, this effective counterweight in Ottawa that an elected Senate might be for representing the less populous regions. And so the provincial premiers have stepped up, I would say illegitimately, into basically setting themselves up as a permanent opposition to the federal government. I think provincial premiers should mind their own business in their own jurisdiction. But to come back to your point about moral suasion, there's a version of the Senate I can get behind. So Justin Trudeau did this thing where he appointed a bunch of people supposedly on a nonpartisan basis. Again, it wasn't really that. They might not have been card-carrying liberals, but they were certainly pretty reliably progressive. Increasingly, towards the end of his term, they were partisan liberals. But what we saw is senators getting more and more uppity about, well, I'm not just a partisan appointment. I have a mandate of virtue. I'm here because of my manifest character and achievements, et cetera. Well, that's really dangerous. But Supposing you said the Senate cannot defeat a bill of the House of Commons under any circumstance, and you don't need a constitutional amendment to do that. The Senate itself could pass its own standing orders to say words to the effect of any bill passed by the House of Commons that has not passed the Senate within 6 months shall be deemed to have passed. So it would be a suspensive veto rather than an actual veto, which is like what they now have for constitutional amendments. So supposing you did that, and supposing you really appointed what you were suggesting, people of the first water, people of the most respected and indeed revered members of the community, I see some virtue in that idea where you'd have a body of people where the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. The collected voices of these very respected people would have strictly moral power. And that I kind of like. I think that's quite a subtle idea, is they would be able to weigh in and say, this bill we think is an abomination for this, and this reason. They wouldn't have the power to defeat it. But if they had a high enough standing in the community, if they were really top appointments and behaved themselves, they would have real moral force that a government would hesitate to go against. And I think that might be the best way to square that particular circle.
You've been listening to a clip of In Bed with the Elephant with me, your host, Adrian Harewood. Be sure to check out the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. And please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast and write a review. We love hearing from you.